If anyone aboard has military flight experience, anyone who has flown evasive maneuvers, please identify yourself.
Any combat pilot on board. The captain's voice cracked over the intercom, static chewing at the edges of his words. Skyline Flight 1189 was under attack. Missiles inbound. 6 minutes to live. In seat 27C, a man in a faded Carhartt jacket set down his coffee and slowly raised his hand. Daniel Reyes didn't look like someone who could save 158 lives. He looked like what he was, a 34-year-old single father flying his son to Ohio for the boy's first visit with his grandparents since the funeral. He sat in seat 27C with his son, Mateo, asleep against his shoulder in 27B, a half-finished dinosaur coloring book sliding off the boy's lap. Daniel's carry-on sat under the seat in front of him. Inside were normal dad things, spare juice boxes, a phone charger, a paperback he hadn't opened since Cleveland Hopkins International. Tucked in the inside zipper pocket, wrapped in a rubber band, was a laminated card he hadn't looked at in 3 years. First time flying with your little guy? The flight attendant, a woman with a name tag that read Patricia, smiled down the aisle. No, ma'am, just first time flying without his mom. Daniel kept his voice light. Patricia's smile faltered for a half-second before she recovered. Well, you picked a smooth one today. Can I get him anything when he wakes up? Apple juice, if you've got it. He'll ask twice. She laughed and moved on. Daniel looked out the window as Charlotte Douglas International shrank below them, the runways turning to gray thread, then nothing. His ex-mother-in-law had cried at the gate. Mateo had made him promise, pinky swear promise, that he'd sit next to the window seat on the way back so he could see the mountains. Nobody on Flight 1189 knew the real reason Daniel's jaw stayed tight through takeoff. It wasn't nerves about flying with a 5-year-old alone. Daniel had flown alone hundreds of times, just not in coach and not with a stranger's hand on the throttle. He reached down and touched the zipper pocket without opening it. Inside was a Department of Defense identification card. It had his photo, his name, and a line most passengers would assume was a joke if they saw it. Captain Daniel R. Reyes, United States Air Force, 335th Fighter Squadron, Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, North Carolina. 211 combat sorties. Separated from active duty November 3, 2022. If you're already wondering why this former fighter pilot is sitting in coach, subscribe. You're about to find out. The man in seat 27A was scrolling through spreadsheets on his phone, something about a shipment delayed out of a distribution center in Fontana, California. The woman in 27D was doing a crossword. Neither of them looked twice at Daniel. To them, he was just another tired dad in coach, hoodie zipped to his chin, probably needing a nap more than anyone else on the plane. They had no idea that the man beside them had once flown F-16s low over Kandahar province to read license plates, that he'd made split-second calls that kept convoys alive on roads that killed better pilots than him, that his old call sign, Longbow, still got used in briefing rooms 2 states away, spoken by men who didn't know he sold his flake jacket at a yard sale the year his wife died. Daniel pulled out his phone and pretended to read the news, but his eyes kept drifting toward the cockpit door. He always felt calmer when he could see it, when he knew roughly who was in control. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude. The seatbelt light chimed off. People got up to use the bathroom, stretch their legs, dig snacks out of overhead bins. Daniel stayed buckled, one arm still braced around his sleeping son. He had a strange feeling low in his stomach. It wasn't turbulence. He'd flown through worse turbulence than this without blinking. This was something else, something that made his pulse tick up a notch and his eyes start scanning exits without being asked to. Something was wrong. It started when Daniel was 19. He'd enlisted the summer after his mother lost her job at the textile plant in Kannapolis, North Carolina, because the Air Force recruiter promised college money and his family needed the sign-on bonus more than they needed him home. Daniel was good at exactly one thing during basic training, the flight aptitude simulator. He beat the squadron record twice in the same week. the instructors started calling him in for extra sessions, watching him the way scouts watch a kid who can hit a fastball nobody else can touch. 6 months later, an evaluation board flew in from Randolph Air Force Base in San Antonio Airfield. They ran him through hours of testing, spatial reasoning, reaction time under stress, decision trees that changed mid-problem to see if he'd freeze. Your scores are in the top 0.5% we've ever recorded. Spatial awareness, reaction speed, decision-making under load. We don't see this in someone with your hours. What are you offering? Fighter track, officer candidate school first, then flight school at Vance Air Force Base, Oklahoma. If you make it through, and most don't, you'd be flying within 18 months instead of the usual 4 years. Daniel signed the papers 2 days later. Flight school broke him down and rebuilt him. He learned aerodynamics and instrument flying and how to keep his hands steady when an instructor pilot deliberately put the aircraft into a spin without warning. He learned to read a threat board in under 2 seconds. By 24, he'd been assigned to the 335th Fighter Squadron, the Chiefs, out of Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, North Carolina. 26, he'd flown combat sorties over Kandahar Province, close air support runs where the margin between a good outcome and a funeral was measured in feet and tenths of a second. His squadron mates called him Longbow because he could put a missile exactly where it needed to go from farther out than anyone trusted themselves to try. His flight lead used to say Daniel could feel an aircraft's limits the way most pilots could feel their own hands. But he was still a person underneath the call sign. He still called his mother every Sunday. He still got homesick during long deployments and kept a photo of a girl named Priya Chandrasekaran, an ER nurse he'd met at a bar outside Goldsboro, North Carolina, taped inside his locker. They married in 2016. Mateo was born in 2021, 3 months before Daniel's last deployment.
Priya died in March of 2022. An aneurysm, sudden, no warning, gone before Daniel's return flight from Ramstein Air Base in Germany had even landed. He held his 8-month-old son in a rental car outside Wayne Memorial Hospital in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and made a decision that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with arithmetic. A single father couldn't deploy. A single father needed to be home. He separated from active duty that November. He sold his flight jacket at a yard sale for $11 to a stranger who had no idea what it was. He took a job managing logistics for a freight company outside Charlotte, the kind of job with predictable hours and no chance ever of a casualty notification officer showing up at his son's door. He learned to braid hair badly. He learned every dinosaur name Mateo could throw at him. He learned to stop flinching at fireworks. He hadn't touched flight controls in 3 years, 8 months, and, if he let himself count, which he trod not to, 11 days. The seatbelt sign chimed on without warning. Up front, past the closed cockpit door, something had gone wrong. Skyline 1189 had been in the air 51 minutes when Captain Marcus Whitfield saw something on his radar that made his blood run cold. "What is that?" His first officer, Angela Torres, leaned across the center console, squinting at the scope. "I don't know." 6 contacts, high speed, too fast for commercial traffic, converging on our position from 4 bearings. Captain Whitfield keyed the radio. "Atlanta Center, Skyline 1189. We show 6 high-speed contacts closing on our position. Can you confirm?" Static answered first. Then, "Skyline 1189, we show no traffic in your vicinity. Your transponder reads clear." But the contacts kept closing, faster now, arranged in a pattern no flock of birds and no weather cell had ever made. Whitfield switched to the emergency military guard frequency, hands already damp on the yoke. "Any station, this is Skyline 1189. We have unknown high-speed contacts converging on our position. Request immediate assistance." A new voice cut through, clipped and precise.
Skyline 1189, this is NORAD Command, Cheyenne Mountain. We have your situation on our screens. Those contacts are unmanned aerial vehicles, unregistered. Flight profile indicates hostile intent. Whitfield's stomach dropped through the floor of the aircraft. This is a commercial passenger flight. We have 158 souls on board over eastern Tennessee. Say again, hostile? Confirmed hostile. We are scrambling F-16s out of the 157th Fighter Wing, McKentry Joint National Guard Base. They are 11 minutes out. Captain, those drones will be inside missile range in approximately 6 minutes. Whitfield's hands went numb on the controls. 22 years flying passenger jets. Nothing in any manual, any simulator, any recurrent training module had ever put those words in his headset. "What do we do?" His voice came out strangled. "Sir, do you have any military-trained pilots on board? Anyone with combat flight or evasive maneuver experience? Check your manifest. Ask your crew to canvass the cabin. You have 6 minutes before those drones reach firing position. Without evasive action, this aircraft will not survive contact." Whitfield stared at the 6 blips crawling across his scope like wolves closing on something wounded. His training covered engine fires, decompression, medical emergencies at 35,000 feet. Not this, never this. Angela was staring at him, wide-eyed. "Marcus, what do we do?" He didn't have an answer. His hand found the PA switch anyway, because doing nothing was worse than doing something wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain." His voice cracked on the last word. He cleared his throat and forced it steady. "I need everyone to listen very carefully." In the cabin, 158 people froze mid-motion, a woman halfway out of the lavatory line, a teenager with earbuds in, a flight attendant with a coffee pot in her hand. "We are currently under attack by unidentified hostile aircraft. They will be within firing range in approximately 6 minutes. Whitfield swallowed. "I am a commercial pilot. I do not have combat flight training. If anyone aboard this aircraft has military flight experience, anyone who has flown evasive or defensive maneuvers, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately. We need you in the cockpit. Please, there are children on this flight." The cabin went silent for 1 full second. Then someone screamed and the silence broke apart entirely. If you want to see whether Daniel can actually save them, subscribe and stay with me. This is where everything changes. Passengers grabbed armrests, seatmates, each other. A man 3 rows up tried to shove towards the front, shouting that he'd flown a Cessna at a county fair once, and maybe that counts. A teenage girl in 19F was already live streaming, sobbing into her phone. "We're going to die. The plane's under attack. I love you, Mom." In seat 27C, Daniel's eyes snapped open. Mateo stirred against his shoulder, still half asleep. Daniel sat very still, heart slamming against his ribs, and for one long breath he thought about staying exactly where he was. "Nobody here knows who you are." The thought arrived fast and tempting. "You could stay in this seat. Keep your arm around your son. Let the professionals handle it. You promised Priya you were done." But there were no professionals who could handle it. That was the entire reason Whitfield's voice had cracked over the intercom. 2 rows up, a woman was pressing her forehead to her daughter's hair, whispering that everything would be fine, her voice too high to be believed. Across the aisle, an older man gripped his wife's hand so hard his knuckles had gone white. And beside Daniel, Mateo blinked awake, confused, reaching for his father's sleeve the way he did every time he woke up somewhere unfamiliar. Daniel thought about Mateo at 9, at 15, at 25. He thought about every version of his son that only existed if this plane made it to the ground in one piece. He unbelted his seatbelt.
"Buddy, I need you to stay right here for me, okay? Buckle stays on, keep your dinosaurs on your lap." Daniel pressed the coloring book gently against his son's chest. Mateo's eyes were wide, scared in the specific way a 5-year-old gets scared when the adults around him stop pretending things are fine. "Daddy, where are you going?" "I have to go help the pilot, Bud. I'll be right back, I promise." Daniel had never broken a promise to his son. He was aware, distantly, of the size of the one he was making now. He stood. He was tall enough that half the panicking cabin noticed him immediately, a grown man moving forward with a calm that didn't match anyone else's face. A man in the aisle grabbed his forearm. "Sir, you need to sit down. We're supposed to brace." "I'm fine." Daniel pulled free without breaking stride, moving past armrests and elbows and a flight attendant frozen mid-step with a coffee pot still in her hand. "Sir, please return to your—" Patricia started, then caught the look on his face and stopped. "Ma'am, I'm a former Air Force combat pilot. I need to speak to your captain right now." Daniel's voice came out steadier than he expected, muscle memory older than fatherhood surfacing beneath the words. Patricia stared at him, an ordinary man in a wrinkled Carhartt jacket, 5 o'clock shadow, a 5-year-old 3 rows back watching him with his hands pressed to the window. What? Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled the laminated card free from the zipper pocket, rubber band still wrapped around it. "Captain Daniel Reyes, United States Air Force, 335th Fighter Squadron, separated November 2022, 211 combat sorties. Your captain asked for anyone with combat flight experience. That's me." Patricia's mouth opened, closed, opened again. An ordinary man with a coloring book kid in coach claiming to be a fighter pilot? It sounded insane. But the captain had asked, and death was closing at 11 miles a minute, and this man was standing in her aisle speaking like someone who said these words in briefing rooms his whole adult life. "Follow me," she said. They pushed forward together, past passengers grabbing at Patricia's sleeve, begging for answers she didn't have. She ignored all of them, focused entirely on getting this stranger to the cockpit before the 6 minutes ran out. The cockpit door swung open. Whitfield turned, hope flaring across his face, hope that dimmed slightly at the sight of a tired-looking man in a Carhartt jacket instead of someone in a flight suit. "We don't have time for—" "Captain Whitfield?" Daniel's voice cut through the panic, low and level. "Captain Daniel Reyes, United States Air Force, retired 211 combat sorties, 335th Fighter Squadron out of Seymour Johnson. NORAD can verify me, but you've got maybe 5 minutes to decide. I need control of this aircraft." Whitfield stared at him, this stranger in a canvas jacket with a 5-year-old's crayon smudge on his sleeve. This man who should have been dozing in coach with his son, not standing in the cockpit claiming 200 combat sorties. Angela shook her head, fast and hard. "Marcus, we don't know this man. This is insane. We can't just—" Whitfield grabbed the radio anyway, hands trembling. "NORAD Command, this is Skyline 1189. We have a passenger claiming to be a retired Air Force combat pilot named Daniel Reyes, 335th Fighter Squadron out of Seymour Johnson." 3 seconds of silence, 3 seconds that felt like drowning. "Skyline 1189, stand by." A pause, keys audible in the background. Then a different voice, sharper. "Captain, we're pulling his separation record now. Confirmed, Captain Daniel R. Reyes, 335th Fighter Squadron, 211 combat sorties, call signed Longbow. Separated November 3rd, 2022, honorable discharge. Sir, if that man is offering to fly your aircraft, you take him. You do not have time to verify further." Whitfield looked at Daniel again, really looked. The tired eyes, the stillness underneath the tension, like a man standing at the edge of something he'd sworn he'd never step into again. "You haven't flown in 3 years, Whitfield said. It wasn't a question so much as a plea for someone to tell him this was still a bad idea. 3 years, 8 months, Daniel said. "It doesn't leave you, Captain, not the parts that matter right now." He glanced towards the cabin, towards the direction of seat 27C, where his son was watching a stranger's father disappear behind a door that didn't open for passengers. "My son is on this plane. I'm not asking for glory. I'm asking because there's nobody else who can do this, and I would rather die trying than sit in 27C and watch it happen." Whitfield felt the floor of his certainty give way entirely. Nothing about the last 4 minutes made sense, but the radar showed 6 real threats closing at real speed, and in 90 seconds they'd be inside missile range regardless of what anyone believed. "What do I do?"
His voice cracked, quieter this time, more honest. Daniel was already moving to the jump seat behind the captain's position, dropping into it with the unconscious economy of a man whose body remembered a routine his mind had spent 3 years trying to forget. He pulled the shoulder straps tight across his chest. "Captain, I'm going to need tactical command of the aircraft. Keep your hands near your yoke in case I need you to take over instrument monitoring. First Officer Torres, I'll need you on throttle management. I can't reach both engines and fly Evasive at the same time." Angela's jaw tightened, but she nodded, sliding her hand toward the throttle levers. Daniel's eyes moved across the instrument panel, altimeter, radar scope, artificial horizon, cataloging everything under 2 seconds, the way he'd been trained a decade earlier over a different set of mountains. "This is going to feel wrong," Daniel said, his voice level despite his climbing pulse. "Commercial aircraft aren't built to fly the way I'm about to fly this one. People are going to be scared. Some might get hurt if they're not braced, but I've done maneuvers like this more times than I can count, and I have never lost an aircraft under my control." He gripped the yoke. His hands, broad and sun-worn from 3 years of freight dock winters, settled onto the controls like they'd never left them. "Captain, do I have your permission to assume tactical command? If you're still with Daniel, stay with us and subscribe. What happens next is the moment everything comes down to his training."
Whitfield swallowed hard. Somewhere behind him, 158 people were praying, screaming, holding their children. Somewhere in Coach, a 5-year-old boy was pressed against a window, waiting for a promise to be kept. "Aircraft's yours, Longbow." The missiles launched at 19,000 feet over Cocke County, Tennessee, 6 of them, each carrying enough explosive yield to tear a Boeing 737 apart in midair. Their guidance systems locking on the thermal bloom of the engines and the broad radar return of the fuselage. Fire and forget weapons. Once airborne, they would track their target until impact or fuel exhaustion. Against an unarmed passenger jet, any single one of them was a death sentence. 6 of them meant certainty. Daniel's hands moved on the yoke. What happened over the next 90 seconds would be studied by aviation safety boards and military flight instructors for years afterwards. Engineers would review the flight data recorder and shake their heads. Pilots would watch the footage and call it impossible. But 158 people would walk off that aircraft in Charlotte to tell the story, so it couldn't be impossible. It could only be Longbow. The 737 rolled hard to the right, not the gentle bank passengers knew from normal flight, but a violent, aggressive turn that sent gravity sideways through the cabin. Overhead bins rattled open, a rolling suitcase broke loose in the aisle, someone's coffee hit the ceiling. "Throttle to 95%, Daniel called, voice flat and certain. Angela's hand shook as she pushed the levers forward. The twin engines roared, thrust climbing past what the aircraft was ever designed to produce at this altitude. On the radar scope, 6 icons closed with terrifying speed. Daniel's eyes flicked between the scope, the artificial horizon, and the windscreen, his mind running angles and closure rates the way it had a decade earlier over Kandahar, muscle and instinct doing the math faster than conscious thought could follow. At the top of the bank, he hauled back on the yoke, the nose lifted sharply, the aircraft climbing at an angle that Whitfield's eyes went wide and his hand instinctively gripped the armrest. "Trust me," Daniel said quietly, mostly to himself. At the peak of the climb, when the aircraft's momentum had nearly bled out, Daniel did something commercial jets are never, under any circumstances, supposed to do. He cut both throttles to idle and pushed the nose down hard. The plane dropped. In the cabin, unbelted passengers lifted from their seats for a half-second of sickening weightlessness. A flight attendant's clipboard floated past her shoulder. Then gravity slammed back with brutal force as Daniel hauled the nose level again, and the G-load pressed everyone down into their seats like a hand on their chests. Daniel felt his vision start to narrow at the edges. Old training surfaced without being asked. Tense the legs, control the breathing, keep blood in the brain.
On the scope, 3 of the 6 missiles lost lock. Their guidance systems, built to track predictable flight paths, couldn't compensate for the sudden thermal and radar shift. They streaked past the fuselage, one close enough that its shadow crossed the cockpit windscreen before tumbling on until their fuel dried over the Cherokee National Forest. 3 missiles remained, their more advanced seekers already recalculating. Angela, Daniel's voice stayed level even as sweat ran down his temple. On my mark, I need full throttle on the left engine only, right engine to idle. Her face went pale. That'll put us into a spin. That's the point. On my mark. Daniel watched the scope, counting down in his head, waiting for the exact window where timing and physics and 11 years of training would align. 3, 2, 1. Mark. Angela slammed the left throttle forward and pulled the right to idle. The aircraft, 158 souls inside it, began to spin. The aircraft rotated around its own center axis in a flat, screaming spin, a maneuver fighter pilots trained for in simulators and almost never attempted in real aircraft because it was violent and disorienting and could, in the wrong hands, become unrecoverable. In the cabin, the screaming had stopped being individual voices and become one continuous sound. Somewhere in coach, Mateo had his face buried against a stranger's shoulder, a woman he'd never met holding him tight because his father wasn't there too. The remaining 3 missiles shot past the spinning fuselage, their guidance computers unable to resolve a target that no longer moved like an aircraft was supposed to move. 2 detonated harmlessly at a distance when their safety protocols triggered. The 3rd circled once, hunting, then ran out of fuel and fell away over the ridgeline below. Daniel brought the spin out of rotation with short, precise corrections, leveling the wings, bringing the nose back to the horizon. For a moment, there was only the sound of the engine settling and Angela's ragged breathing beside him. Then the radio crackled. Skyline 1189, this is Python 11, 157th Fighter Wing out of McEntire. We are entering your airspace now, engaging remaining threats. A pause. Whoever's flying that aircraft, that was the cleanest defensive break I've seen outside of a training range in 20 years. Daniel's hand found the transmit switch, his voice rougher than he wanted it to be. Python 11, this is Reyes. Clear my 6. I've got 158 people who need to get home. A longer pause this time. Reyes? Longbow? 3/3? Yes, sir. Copy that, Longbow. Python flight, you heard the man. Let's clear this airspace. The F-16 swept past the cockpit windows in formation, close enough that passengers pressed to the glass could make out the tail markings. Their missiles found the remaining drones within seconds. 6 distant explosions bloomed against the mountains, far enough away that the shockwaves never reached the cabin, close enough that everyone saw them. For a moment, the cabin didn't understand they were saved. Then, slowly, the screaming turned into something else. Sobbing, praying, a ragged kind of laughter that only comes after people are certain they were about to die, and then, somehow, weren't. Daniel's hands had started shaking now that there was nothing left to fly. The adrenaline was draining out of him fast, leaving behind an exhaustion that sat in his chest like wet sand. He took a slow breath, held it, let it out. The same technique an instructor had taught him at 22, the same one he still used, without realizing it, every time Mateo had a nightmare.
Captain Whitfield, his voice was quiet now. Aircraft's yours. Threats neutralized. I'd recommend continuing to Charlotte and declaring an emergency for priority handling. Your fuel state's going to be tighter than normal after that. You should probably make an announcement. People are going to need to hear your voice. Whitfield took the controls back with hands that shook worse than Daniel's. He looked over, really looked for the first time since the cockpit door had opened, at the man beside him. Faded jacket, crayon smudge on the sleeve, a wedding ring he still wore 3 years after there was no longer a wife to wear it for. "Who are you?" Whitfield asked, quietly, like the question mattered more than anything on the instrument panel. Daniel unbuckled from the jump seat. "I'm just somebody who used to do this for a living, sir. I stopped because I had somebody more important to fly straight for. He paused at the cockpit door. I'd like to get back to my son now, if that's all right. He's probably scared out of his mind. Whitfield found the PA button with a hand that hadn't stopped shaking. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. The threat has been neutralized. United States Air Force fighters have destroyed the hostile aircraft. We are safe. He paused, searching for words that didn't exist in any training manual. I need to tell you something. We were saved today by a passenger, a former Air Force combat pilot who happened to be sitting in seat 27C. I can't give you more than that right now, but I want every one of you to know that you are alive because of his skill and his courage, and I will be forever grateful he was on this flight. We'll be on the ground in Charlotte in approximately 22 minutes.
Captain Whitfield found Daniel near the coffee station. He looked different than he had in the cockpit, steadier but older around the eyes. I took a leave of absence after that flight, not because I was hurt, because I realized in 6 minutes how little I actually knew how to do if something like that happened again.
I've been taking emergency maneuver courses at a training center outside Mesa, Arizona. Figured if a man who hadn't flown in 4 years could do what you did, the least I could do was try to be ready. That's not nothing, Captain. Neither was what you did for my passengers. Captain shook his hand, held it a beat longer than a handshake usually lasts. Thank you, Longbow. Angela Torres hugged him and admitted she still watched the flight data recorder footage sometimes just to remind herself it had actually happened, that a man in a Carhartt jacket had really done that with a commercial aircraft full of people. A man Daniel barely remembered from seat 14A came up holding a phone with a photo on the screen. Himself, a wife, 2 teenage kids on a beach in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I quit my sales job 2 weeks after that flight, took a smaller title, better hours at a company out of Rock Hill, spent the whole flight worried about a shipment out of Fontana, never even looked at your son sitting next to you until it almost didn't matter anymore. He shook Daniel's hand. You made me remember what I was actually flying home to. Near the end of the evening, Priya's mother, who had driven up from Goldsboro for the reunion because Daniel had asked her to come, found him by the window. She had cried at the gate the day this all started, not knowing what she was crying about yet. She would have been so proud of you, not for the flying, for choosing not to all those years, and then choosing to anyway for one day because it mattered. Daniel didn't have a response for that. He just nodded and let her hold his hand for a while. That night, back in his apartment in Matthews, North Carolina, Daniel tucked Mateo into bed and sat for a long time afterwards on the edge of the boy's bed, listening to him breathe. On his dresser sat a small wooden box he hadn't opened in years. His separation papers, a photo of Priya on their wedding day at St. Andrew Catholic Church in Apex, and the laminated military ID, rubber bands still wrapped around it, edges soft from being carried. He added one more thing to the box that night, a folded copy of the Charlotte Observer front page from the week of the incident, headline reading, "Local Father's Hidden Past Saves Flight 1189. He didn't need the story told to strangers. He needed it there for Mateo, for the day the boy was old enough to understand that the quietest people in a room are sometimes the ones who already gave everything they had once and chose to give something different after. He turned off the light. Somewhere down the hall, Mateo mumbled something about dinosaurs in his sleep. Daniel stood in the doorway a moment longer than he needed to, the way he did most nights, just watching his son breathe. A man who once flew faster than sound, now standing perfectly still, exactly where he wanted to be.